Welcome friends, good morning. Today we are running a world literature lecture series, and it's a part of that, and this is CEC Gurukul live lecture series. And under the world literature series we have already covered a large number of cultures, a large number of literatures, countries, their literary output, and we are on the last leg of our series. This time it would be Southeast literature, and next time we will be doing European literature minus English and America. So in this series, this is the last this is one of the last lectures, and we have the expert Dr. Richa Bajaj for this, and she teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University, and she is a person of literary theory, and she has done also work on Indian writing in English. So the topic is poetry in Indonesia, and we will be talking about that. She will be giving a discussion, and she will be presenting her point of view. And before we start talking, and Dr. Richa Bajaj is requested to speak, let me tell you, friends, that we are available for discussion on this lecture in the last 20 minutes, so starting from 10:40 going up to 11, and this time can be utilized by the observers, by the listeners, by the viewers, and they can ask questions, they can make queries, they can give their own point of view, and we can then share each other's ideas and learn from each other, mutually speaking. So for this discussion that we have in the last 20 minutes of this lecture, there is a number with us, and this is toll-free number. The number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, the toll-free number for 20-minute discussion towards the end of the lecture is 1-800-110-430. And because this is poetry in Indonesia, so Dr. Richa Bajaj, welcome to the lecture, and let me make a kind of share with you the impression that I have of Indonesian writing. Indonesia is next door for us. It's not very far from India, and when one goes to Indonesia, one comes across a large number of Indians also. So we have that kind of nearness. So maybe there are certain parallels. I'm just guessing. I have not read Indonesian literature the way you would have. But I'm guessing that there will be some parallels, close parallels, or at least distant parallels between what is being written in India and what is being written in Indonesia today. And since you are focusing on poetry, there I think the reach of the poetry is going to be higher than would have been the case in fiction. So all these questions appear, to me, and I feel that they should be discussed in some detail. And poetry in Indonesia I believe would have use of myths. It would be a modern country. It would be a secular country. It has secular kind of politics for a long time, and all that would have percolated to the literary expression. So I would request you now to give us your view of general view of Indonesian writing, and let's see how it shapes up in this lecture.
Yes, in the sense that there are a couple of points you've raised, one being that whether there are any parallels between India and Indonesia, and the second that what kind of culture and what kind of literature is available in the region because of certain influences that they've had coming from the West, because they have been also colonized like India by the Dutch, and the Dutch actually came to Indonesia in the 16th century, but 1800 onwards the Dutch East Indies is set up, the Dutch company is set up, which is going to govern and now rule Indonesia from 1800 onwards. So from then on till the 20th century, when during the Second World War, in fact, you see this kind of the Dutch presence is overwhelming, and it's very much that in that sense there is a kind of a parallel between the British Indian experience and the Dutch Indonesian experience, I would say. So the process of colonization and also the nationalist movement in Indonesia took shape in the early 1900 or so, from the first and the second decades onwards. In fact, 1920s is also the time when the political leader Sukarno becomes an important figure for nationalism in Indonesia, and Sukarno in fact becomes engaged in active politics at this time, at this particular time. So this is one very important feature, because and he's imprisoned a couple of times during this period, during the period of national struggle. 1920s is also the period when the language issue in Indonesia becomes important. In fact, very much like India, I think Indonesia also has a similar problem of national identity. So in fact, what one finds is that this kind of national identity surfaces only in the 20th century. Till then, it's a conglomerate of many islands, or an archipelago, in fact, that Indonesia is. Yes.
So you have raised 2 points, and both the points are very relevant, and they are valuable for discussion, like nationalism. And nationalism is against a colonizer, which means Indonesia as a country would have become united against a common enemy, and the same thing happened perhaps in India. So that is one parallel. And the second, as you say, is the linguistic parallel. Of course, in India, we had the English colonizers and they had Dutch colonizers. So they imposed their language on us, and the Dutch colonizer would have imposed Dutch language on those people. So did they gain much from the Dutch experience, the Dutch literature, the values that they were in Dutch? That was a European country, so was England, and both were colonizers. So they would be suppressing, but at the same time, they would also be giving some benefit of their literature to the people there.
No, I think overall, of course, you see, they became aware of Dutch literature, and by that logic, and they became aware of the English language as well. And so Western literature filtered through the Dutch and filtered through the colonizing countries' literature. And so in that sense, they became familiar. A lot of writers in the 20th century became familiar with Western literature because of colonization, as was the case in India. But having said that, I think Indonesians have been always very conscious of their particular identities. There are more than 300 ethnic groups in Indonesia, and about almost regional languages, they go up to around 700 regional languages. So
really?
It's like there is so much of their own, and so many languages and so many sub ethnic groups, that I think finally it's a kind of a mishmash of several identities that they are negotiating all the time. So but what happened, and so it wasn't as they were not trying to in fact understand or negotiate that kind of reality with the Dutch experience. In fact, they were all the time trying to understand and unite with one another. That was an important point in there.
There was a process of learning from other languages in the country itself.
The process of learning, but also the process of evolving a national language, or which could be called Indonesian in itself. So Bahasa Indonesia is the new national language of Indonesia, which has come into being only in the 20th century because of the nationalist movement in the country. So you see how the writers increasingly start aligning themselves. So there are writers have been writing in their regional languages, but then they start moving towards writing in Bahasa Indonesia, which is the national language of the country. So there is this kind of movement that takes place as well.
How does a national movement help evolve a language which unites the country? Any idea? What I understand by this is that, as it happened in the case of India, that leaders were supposed to communicate their viewpoint and their opinions to the people, and for that they required a language that would be spoken all over the place. And since there was no such language initially, then they had to evolve a language. This is what happened in India. Is there a parallel there also?
In the sense that a new national language comes to the fore. Yes, exactly what I said, that a new national language comes to the fore because the country needs to be united at some level of language. Otherwise, till the 20th century, Indonesia wasn't even looked at as a kind of a country, and was looked at as a kind of as I said, an archipelago, which is a kind of an island nation. So lots of islands together living, but there is no sense of national identity or a unified identity that they have. So language tries to unify the country, and this becomes important in the wake of their nationalist struggle and their movements that go on. You know, there's a national party which comes into being in the early 20th century. So all these require a kind of a joining thread for the people to feel one with one another, very similar to the Indian experience. So that is definitely the case. So yeah, let me just give a kind of a brief background of,
I think that will be useful. Yes, do that.
Yes. So I'll just give a brief background of the country of Indonesia. In fact, so Indonesia is it was once known, of course, as the Dutch East Indies, and it is a tropical country under the Dutch rule. Of course, it was called the Dutch East Indies, and it's only after independence that it has turned to it's called Indonesia now. So it is a tropical country and has many fertile islands, as I mentioned earlier, such as Java or Bali and Sumatra. And this region, it also has many volcanic regions. So because of which life is quite unpredictable in the region, and particularly the kind of volcanoes and the kind of volcanoes and tsunamis, that the threats is a very imminent threat for them. So they're always living in a state of uncertainty in many ways, which is to do with the region itself. Having said that, it's a beautiful landscape, and because of its tropical country, the climate creates this condition of a very happy living for the people. So in that, and you see, and there are the ancient literature then in Indonesia was written in regional languages, in many regional languages, such as the Javanese and the Sudanese. And but today, of course, now that situation has changed, because in the 20th century the Bahasa Indonesia has come into being, and it started to show its there were books, journals published, in fact, which collected literature written in Bahasa Indonesia. So the early 20th century is also the period when Indonesian nationalism is beginning to take shape, and this in a way influences the kind of literature that is being written at the time as well. So it's not to say that Indonesia leaves out is only the 20th. In many ways, modern Indonesian literature is very different from what has been written in the ancient period and what has been written in the medieval times. But certain indigenous forms of poetry have also made way into the modern period, or in the modern poetry of Indonesia.
Modern period begins in the 20th century.
Yes, the modern.
After the Second World War?
No, I mean the 20th century onwards. I'm talking about the overall 20th century, where so beginning from the first and the second decades, and as I said, 1920s onwards, the language is coming to the fore. The Bahasa Indonesia language has emerged on the scene.
That has emerged in the 20th century.
Right.
So now there is one unifying language in which literature is written.
But there is literature written in regional language even in the 20th century. But the need for a national language to fight the British, to unify the people, comes to the fore in the 20th century particularly. And then literature writers are also moving towards writing in the national language, that is the Bahasa Indonesia.
And they carry their vocabulary, they carry their ideas from regions. From
yes,
their own
or
regions.
yes, because of the different regions, because there are some of them are Javanese, some of them are Malay, and a large chunk of the population in Indonesia, because it shares the border with Malaysia as well. So there's a large chunk of Malay population as well in Indonesia, and Indonesia in that sense professes a large chunk of people who profess in Islam. Their faith is Islam. So there are these influences which come from the East and from the Asian side as well. It's a kind of a mix of Buddhism as also Islam. So all these categories are important when we are looking at the indigenous population.
In your opinion, literature written in Bhasha language, as you call it, does it become national literature then?
Yes, of course, because it is written in a national language, it turns to talking about national concerns
issues,
and issues such as of unity. And in fact, their motto is very much the same as India unity in diversity. So they also follow that motto because obviously it's so diverse. In fact, they're physically, they are divided because the nation itself, and it's in that sense, it's very difficult to bring it together under one head.
And this national literature is getting regular feeding from regional languages.
Regional, yes, regional languages and regional issues as well. So the language is changing, but and the language is changing so that people start moving towards a kind of a unified existence. So I was talking about the indigenous forms of poetry that have survived in the modern period, and they've been used by certain writers. So one such form was the pantun, which was a 4-line short poem and which had 2 couplets in it with a regular rhyme, and this was extensively deployed by the 16th century Sumatran Malay poet Hamza Pansuri. And Pansuri was a Sufi poet, religious in turns, so he would move into so religious poetry, religion approached through Sufi writing. So he's also sometimes called as the metaphysical poet because he's yoking different experiences into this one sensibility, which is both Sufistic in nature and at the same time material. Now this kind of an attribute is carried forward in the modern period by Amir Hamza, who's the 20th century poet, Sumatran poet again. He's born into the family of sultans, and he's born in 1911 and dies in 1946.
What is Sufism?
Sufism Sufism coming from coming from the Persian side, and as in fact it comes via or through, I would say, India as well. So Sufism is in the context of Indonesia particularly is an alternate approach to God, is an approach to God which is not based on ritual ceremonies or in any way adhering to mainstream religion. So in fact it tries to it becomes a kind of an answer of sorts to the kind of conservative orthodox Muslim culture in even in Malaysia and in Indonesia as well.
Can you call it spiritualism then?
Yes, sort of. It is spiritual because it bases itself on the spirit or the soul, which then unites with God or the godly figure.
What about the humanist part? Can it also be called humanist?
Yes, it can be called humanist because it doesn't because it is not elitist in the sense that it doesn't one doesn't have to go to the Maulvi, one doesn't have to go to the mosque essentially to pray and to reach a union with God, and that in collective chantings or in collective songs and dance, you could actually find a union in God. So in that sense, it is to do with the common people and the common areas of life, which would be the street, the crossroads where these Sufi saints would sing and also then chant the name of God.
They dance, they celebrate.
Right. Also, you see, the idea of fana and the idea is very important, which is self-annihilation, in the sense that you annihilate your personal identity and in order to meet God. So you need to the self of the person is not very important in this case.
So that's a strong tradition in Indonesian
yes,
poetry?
It is a strong tradition coming from the medieval period. So it is one of the traditions of
can you give an example of those 4 lines and things like this?
I don't remember offhand. So
not in the sense that in India there is Doha, somewhere else it can be Rubai, and then those 4 lines. And
no, like the pantun is a form, just as you're calling a doha. It's a form. It's not and the pantun, the first couplet is a very generalized couplet, and the second couplet is a personalized couplet. So the general then moves towards there's a shift. So the first 2 lines, it will be a generalized couplet, and the second couplet would be a personalized view of the poet. Which is
that makes it very interesting. It's a kind of intellectual effort that is supposed to be done by the viewer. That the personalized is finally becoming general.
No, the generalized becomes the personal in the case of in the case of the poets. So, this kind of a tradition of Sufism is then carried forward in the 20th century by Amir Hamza, who's again a Sumatran poet, as I mentioned, and he's born into the family of sultans, so has an upper middle class kind of an upbringing, and again he takes forward Pansuri's idea of Sufism, religious poetry and mysticism. In fact, he's a very well-read poet because of his upper middle class upbringing and intellectual culture that he was a part of. He's able to he's able to blend Amir Hamza is able to blend the spiritual and the material in his poetry. So in a way, he takes forward the religious mystical experience, but then also at the same time projects the love emotion that he may have for a woman. So you know how these there is a kind of ambiguity, and the writer alternates between his experience of love for the woman and his devotion for God. So in a way, they're always he alternates between the two, and he's as I said, this kind of tradition again is very popular in this Southeast Asian region, in India, in Indonesia, Malaysia, all these regions. You see that this kind of tradition becomes very popular because Amir Hamza was a very well-read poet. He was also a translator. He translated, in fact, the Bhagavad Gita. And also his brother, who was Hamza's brother, Amal Hamza, he actually translated Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali. So we can see the kind of influences that are working on the poet, and you know what makes him write the stuff that he writes. So he's also very well aware of the Persian Oriental literatures in the regions, along with the classical Malay literary works. So you see, with this kind of strong intellectual upbringing that Amir Hamza had, he was able to give a kind of a direction to the literary writing of Indonesia, and in that sense I think he became an important figure in the early 20th century, because he was seen as a kind of an intellectual literary writer in that sense. And
can you call it a social art, an art that is observed at the level of society? People take part in it. They sing and dance along with the person who leads them.
Amir Hamza's poetry is not the sing and dance type. It has turned introspective and mystical. In fact, the kind of, if I have to find a parallel in India, it would be like Rabindranath Tagore's poetry. So, because, and he's aware of Gitanjali, he's also read Gitanjali. So, there is mysticism and the self and the introspection of the self.
So
the Sufism or the Sufi saint of the 16th century has turned into an intellectual in the 20th century in Amir Hamza. He is not he's not going to go to the street. So there is this sense of introspection of the poet that has come into being, an intellectual working out in the poet's mind, but not a kind of a common collectivity that it was in the medieval period.
That can be called a kind of gift of the 20th century to the poetic tradition. That earlier it was social art, but now it is getting more and more intellectual, more and more analytical. And
yes, it's become literary, I would say, which it was not in the early period. So it has become, and if you could call it later on, it becomes a kind of a canon of its own kind. So Amir Hamza is not going to go to the streets and sing his songs, but he's going to remain in his enclosed sphere and yet find a resolution with God, and also at the same time go into the mystical direction. But the point is, the poet is aware that he must not leave his own personal emotion as well, or the self, the side that is very dear to him.
This can be called a kind of individualism. The person is talking from the personal experience, adding to the tradition and then making it modern.
In the sense that he also adds the personal with the cosmos, with the universe. So it's, I'd say, from the personal to the universal, and the personal and the social are not seen as two different identities or different categories in Amir Hamza.
Now that we are talking about world literature, so they are basically the voice of world literature. Would you say that?
Yes, of course.
Cosmos.
Cosmos, yes, but
together.
they're not aware of the sensibilities of other. They're aware because obviously they're translating, and you know, he translated the Bhagavad Gita, and he's aware of Chinese, Persian traditions as well of writing, Oriental tradition of writing. So I would say that, and also the Western writers, because of Dutch interventions and the colonial experience that they've had. So I think in that sense, being in Indonesia, such writers had the kind of exposure of world literature. I'd say the West was merely just curious perhaps at one level. So there was curiosity, and there was an understanding of the West, but which was mediated by personal experience. And so you understood of the West through a writer of your own. But today's world literature, you can access the writer directly, a world literature writer directly. But in that period, I think you had to mediate, you had to understand the other side through a writer of your own country, and so there was a kind of a
Blending
mediation
of the,
or a mutability of sorts that took place at this level. So in any case, I was talking about Amir Hamza's poetry, and I could read out a couple of lines from a poem of Amir Hamza, and one of his poems is titled Maybe, and he displays his romantic sensibility in this. And he starts with, I quote, "You who lie quietly in my heart, like the thinnest breath of heaven, unfolding the world in your immensity, yet so small an eyebrow hides you. I raise you up, my tongue exalts you. I wrap you in my song, rock you in my lullabies. Up, O mountain, open your eye of pearl, move your delicate fingers along the strings of the lute of paradise. Let the goddess of song awaken, love's dancer, slender and straight, supple as leaping fire, subtle as incense. Dance, virgin, dance, sing in your golden voice. Maybe the waves of memory will crash, will lie down on the shore of my heart."
What do you say about this
Unquote.
poem?
So a couple of things that that I thought was that one could talk about. One, of course, that you know, how he's able to go to the infinite and then come to the smallest drop. When he says that you know, enfolding the world in your immensity, and yet so small an eyebrow hides you. So again, talking about this, the smallest object in the world, and then again connecting the smallest speck of the earth with the cosmos or with the universe, and trying to bringing them together, these disparate things or divided things in that sense. And then the poet, who is in the middle and trying to mediate between these 2 points, the smallest and you know, in that sense, the immensity that he talks about. And you who lie quietly in my heart, and it is and the poet, it is in the mind of the poet, in the heart of the poet as well. So in a way, the poet becomes a kind of interlocutor of this kind of experience, and therefore he is going to talk about, he'd say, my tongue exalts you and I wrap you in my song. So there is a sense that the poet has a responsibility, or is attempting to talk about this experience, this entire universe.
What is you in the poem? I and you. What is you?
The I is, of course, the poet, and the you is could be, there are these interpretations which could work here. One being that the you is actually God, which is present in every form. So it turns into this kind of mystical, romantic, religious sensibility. And the you see at another level, could be the beloved of the person as well, whom he sees in every part of his life, and whom he exalts in his poem. So there is this sense that both these attributes are available.
What about nature?
And yet,
what about nature? He talks to the mountain also.
Yes, yes. So he talks about upper mountain, as he say, open your eye of pearl and your delicate fingers and the stirrings of the lute of paradise, suggesting again this kind of oneness. There is a kind of uniformity in Amir Hamza of experience, in the sense that the human and the divine, along with the natural scape, they are not seen as different entities, and one is the extension of the other. So and you see, there is this kind of even when he has left, he is not going to go to the street to sing these songs. There is this kind of Sufi strain when he says, let the love's dancer, slender and straight, subtle as incense, as he says, and he says, dance virgin dance, sing in your golden voice. So he is evoking that tradition, even as he is not going to sing it out, but in his mind he is evoking the tradition of the Sufi poets who have been a part of Indonesian culture and folk literature all along.
Would you call it predominantly philosophical or poetic? Predominantly, that is.
Yes, I think it is philosophical, and but it is because it's using the form of poetry, you could call it poetic in that sense. But in itself, at the level of codes or symbols that may exist in poetry, that they're not meant to be so in Amir Hamza. Poetry is meant as a lyric. To be a lyric of or to be as a kind of a song that is not sung and is read out, but carries the philosophical strain of the times.
To me, the terms are aesthetic and sensuous.
Yes,
and
even sensuous. Yes.
Because the way nature is evoked, the way you is evoked, the way other things are evoked.
Sensuous, I think, because it tries to remain material, as I said earlier also. He's a poet who's trying to talk also about the emotion of the individual and not just talk about the religious experience, as I said earlier. That because he's trying to remain material and grounded, then that adds to the sensuous quality of the poem, along with the intellectual streak that takes him towards a kind of a philosophical.
So the range is very wide. The
Yes.
range is very wide.
I mean, I think he sets a kind of a canon for other literatures to come into being. So, following this kind of a romantic mystical surge in poetry, a new phase emerges, with the poets of the generation of 1945 in Indonesia. They are popularly known as the Angkatan 45, and this was also the period when the political atmosphere of the country was highly charged, and Indonesia had assumed a kind of a national identity and was fighting for independence. Now, during this time and the Second World War, in the wake of the Second World War, you had Japanese forces that arrived in Indonesia in 1941, and during the Second World War, then this kind of struggle for independence had also reached its peak, and when the Japanese forces surrendered to the British in 1945, Indonesia was declared itself independent. Now, Indonesia declared itself independent, but the Dutch refused to go, and in 1945 was the Indonesian Revolution, but the colonial Dutch power still resisted, and they tried to get more forces and try to curb this kind of a revolution of the country, and they continued to fight in Indonesia for the next 4 years, and finally they had to they had to let go, and the Indonesian Nationalist Party and the guerrilla groups and the troops that were there in the countryside. So the Indonesian Nationalist Party worked in the cities, and the guerrilla troops worked in the countryside. They together fought the Dutch powers, and finally the Dutch withdrew and conceded Indonesia's independence in 1949.
Did this trend produce a specific kind of poetry, this nationalist assertion?
Yes, there is so the poets of the 1945 generation, they are in that sense progressive in nature, and they are all looking towards a kind of social realism, is what defines their poetry. But so this period is a period of uncertainty and also instability in Indonesia, but also the assertion of writers. So farmers and workers had also organized themselves into groups by this time, and they were already full of this kind of zest to fight for their rights. So this caused this kind of a period of uncertainty, and yet I think the country tried to stabilize itself under a kind of a guided democracy, you could call it, or it's often called as a guided democracy. But then this period actually, the post-war period, the post-World War, Second World War period in Indonesia saw a group of writers, the generation of 1945. Among them was one important writer who occupies a significant place here, would be Chairil Anwar. And but the Cheryl Anwar, he's a poet who's very direct in his style, assertive in his tone, and yet at the same time romantic and also fiercely Indonesian about in his poetry. So there is this sense that that the writers are bold and assertive in this period, and they are not going to withdraw, or they're full of optimism in this particular period. So Anwar, actually Cheryl Anwar died young at the age of 27. So in 1949 he passed away. So but he drew inspiration from the Western writers and also translated Hemingway and T.S. Eliot among other writers into the native language, suggesting that the intellectual culture of the country is also widening in scope, and also becoming more inclusive in that sense, and learning. So writers are constantly evolving in this period vis-a-vis the Western literature that is available at hand, and but not turning away from indigenous spirit. It is often said that modern Indonesian literature is not Indonesian at all, and it is in fact just modern literature that would be available in any other country, and that is an allegation that is generally put against these writers. But I think they are very conscious of their Indonesian sensibility. In fact, even as they are talking about issues that concern other countries or can be seen as world issues all over, they are conscious of that very specific Indonesian reality of the peasant, of the ordinary people, of a middle class individual, how one lives and out one's life in this particular period. So in one of the poems, Anwar, I'm just giving a very short example from one of his poems. It is called Agreement with Friend Sukarno. He maintains a very casual tone of intimacy, in fact, as shared between friends. And he says in this poem, Agreement with Friend Sukarno, I quote, "Hey friend Sukarno, give me your hand and let's set everything ship-shape. You and me, we're made out of the same stuff," unquote. So you can see the conversational style and the very note that it begins on, calling out the national leader, who's seen as the a stalwart, a political stalwart in the country at the time, and calling him "Hey Sukarno," as if he's your friend, your dear one, and how the individual feels that he needs to participate in this entire movement of building the nation up. When he says, "Give me your hand and let's set everything ship-shape," he seems to suggest that we are going to collectively set things right in the country, what has not been the case. So in a way, suggesting that the writer felt one with the political ideology of the time, and also that one felt integrated and participatory in this entire exercise of nation building. So that is the important point that one needs to note about the generation of the 1945.
Friends, at this stage, let me tell you that we are reaching the time of discussion. So if there are any questions that you want to ask from 10:40 onwards, then you are welcome to do so. You can give your own observations also, and the toll-free number that is available to you, let me repeat it again. It is 1-800-110-430. You can use this toll-free number to ask your questions, to give your observations. And Dr. Bajaj, please continue tell us something about this poem and the kind of oneness that you are talking about, the between the national leader and the individual poet. I think the individual poet is not merely asking questions, but also sharing one's own experiences with the national leader. Is that the case?
Actually, this is what I'm trying to say here is that the national leader that Sukarno was, he inspired many writers at the time, and he became a kind of a subject of poetry in many writings and in many poetry written during this period, and the kind of hopes and aspirations that an entire generation had in this period vis-a-vis their own country. But of course, so the 1940s is the period of nation building in 1949 onwards, when Sukarno actually takes over. So let me in fact talk to you something about Sukarno, and then I could actually move on to the period of the coup in Indonesia, which caused a kind of a massacre, and in fact it was a tale of horror in Indonesia, something that has fractured the sensibility of Indonesia in the coming that would fracture the sensibility of Indonesia in the coming times. Let me speak a bit about this particular period. So Sukarno, of course, spearheaded the Indonesian independence movement from the 1920s onwards, as I said, and in 1940, Su, in fact, in his name is a kind of an honorific that is attached to his name, Karno. So he in fact became the first Indonesian president in 1949 until he was overthrown by the military coup of 1965-66, which was headed by Suharto. Now, what I mean to say is that something happened. Sukarno had been the leader or the person who was guiding the democracy. It was obviously he was very close to the Communist Party of Indonesia, PKI, and so he tried to build a kind. He had close relations with the Soviet Union and China as well. So this created this kind of, and in the atmosphere of the Cold War, this did not go well with United States, of course, and so the United States from the outside was providing foreign aid to the rebellious groups in Indonesia. In fact, during the reign of Sukarno, there are instances that are given to us that in 1958 or so, the US actually tried to aid certain rebellious groups in Indonesia, and in fact it's only when their pilot was captured that while conducting bombing operations that killed Indonesian soldiers and civilians, it was only then that they withdrew. So these kind of cases, that the CIA backed these armed regional rebellions in the region during the 1950s. So this exercise kept on happening, and what you see in 1965 is in fact recorded in several documents. So what happened in 1965 was that Suharto, who was an Indonesian military leader supported by the United States, he accused the Indonesian Communist Party, which was the PKI, of organizing a coup and of kidnapping and killing certain high-ranking officials. And Suharto claimed that some of the officers had been murdered. So and therefore he went ahead with his own military coup. And over the months, once he had occupied in 1965 in October and then onwards 66 in 66, he undertook a kind of a systematic extermination of up to 1 million Indonesians for having affiliations with the Communist Party. Now, and they were these people were either having affiliations, or according to the Suharto discourse, that 1 million people, 1 million Indonesian people were killed just because they had affiliation with the Communist Party, or they were accused of harboring leftist views or sympathies. In fact, he then took the power and ruled as dictator with US support till about 1998. So, and this period from 65 to 1998, in fact, this period is a period of repression and censorship in Indonesia. So much so that writers have written articles saying that the Indonesian population has been silenced in this particular period. Now, this gets articulated then in poetry also, and you find that writers take it up in poetry and start discussing this kind of life and the CIA's involvement in this entire enterprise and this how it worked. Before going actually to the poet, I wanted to talk about Apin, who's Rivai Apin, who actually talks about this exercise that was conducted, this kind of mass brutal killing of an entire generation of people. There is actually an article which was published in the Atlantic, which is an American magazine, in fact, that brought out the declassified documents, and these declassed documents, and I would like to quote here that was brought out, and this article is written by Winston Vincent Bevins, and the article is titled "What the United States Did in Indonesia," and this came out in 2017. And here Bevins says, and I quote, "A trove of newly declassified diplomatic cables reveals a surprising degree of American involvement in a brutal anti-communist purge in Indonesia half a century ago." So these declassified documents further illustrated the horror of Indonesia's 1965 mass murder. They also confirmed that US authorities backed Suharto's purge. Perhaps even more striking, as the documents show, US officials knew most of his victims were entirely innocent. US embassy officials even received updates on the executions and offered help to suppress media coverage. Unquote.
Did it register in the writing of the period?
Yes. So I just wanted to quote from an actual documentation of these declassified, documents that are available of this kind of industrial scale slaughter that took place in 1965. In fact, what Bevin suggests is that in Indonesia there is no official record of how many people were killed and what really happened. So only the Suharto side of history is available, and the other side is blacked out. So this kind of a thing gets registered in poetry, and the important poet who is a part of the cultural wing of the Communist Party, and it's called the People's Cultural League, called the LECRA, and here in Indonesia is Rivai Apin. Now Rivai Apin is born in 1927 and he stays up to 1995. He was imprisoned. He was a political prisoner, and he was not killed like many of his associates, but remained under the tight eye, under the scrutiny of the powers that be. So he was in detention in 1967 onwards. So Apin is a major literary voice in this period, and obviously a committed
Any telling lines from this poet?
Yes. I would like to quote two of his poems. So the first poem is titled "Between Two Unfinished Worlds." That morning I heard the news. I went into the street. Peddlers and people trying to go to work hugged the edges of the road. Speeding cars, heavy with soldiers and tanks, met no resistance. Soldiers patrolled, marching 2 by 2, carrying guns, and among them an 88, but a loaded one. Everything jumbled together, men and things and the air, each hung with its price tag. I went to friends to talk. The truth turned into blackness.
Very telling line. Very telling line.
Yes, very news. And I'm just reading out the poem, then maybe we can discuss as well. The news, Jogja had fallen. Jogja was the capital of Indonesia at that time. Maguwo Karno was captured. Hatta Shajarir. We talked on, or went from friend to friend to friend. We talked, we thought, and we discovered hope. All of it in one word. And because of one word. That evening I went home, burdened with the news and our hope. I was greeted by my unfinished self. Open books, unread books, books I had to finish. But for this I had left my father and my brother. And then I remembered I had eaten only once that day. The pot of rice was there all along, and the self I had been lay in its hollow grave, dug by the glow of a lamp, burning in the darkness. And when the soldiers had gone, there was sound of weeping women, wives and mothers. I don't need to tell who was taken away. All I could do was pound my head against the table, tortured by that word, rootless but already growing in its unfinished world. Unquote.
This goes exactly parallel to what happened in Chile.
Yes, very much.
And
In Vietnam.
And in Vietnam.
So, you see, US involvement in Vietnam and Chile and other Latin American coups that took place has been registered to some extent. But this one in Indonesia is seldom talked about. In fact, it is not even registered in the historical documents in Indonesian. So, the Indonesian population would also be somewhat unclear of what exactly happened. And it is only through poetry like this that suddenly one realizes that the reality has been there all along, only not in official documents.
And as you were reading this poem, the voice of Pablo Neruda was ringing through this.
Yes.
References to war, references to persecution,
Yes.
killing, and destruction, all those things were there.
Yes.
And the use of the I.
Yes.
I am a witness. I mean, the I is the witness there.
That's true.
So that kind of authentication.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. What is not available in the official records gets registered through poetry, and poetry that is unrelenting and resisting at the same time the kind of violence that is done to people. And he doesn't need to say who's being taken, but Karno captured, the capital taken, in siege. So all this gets registered through poetry of this kind.
So kudos to poetry.
Yes.
Poetry is
in that
taking
sense,
casualty,
yes, which is why I thought that this particular period is kind of either fudged in the history of Indonesia or definitely given a very different coloring. And in this sense, a million people get killed because they have affiliations. And PKI was not a kind of a underground movement. It was a legal party of the country. It was legalized. It had its own channel. It was operating as a kind of a government unit. And the CIA involvement, the United States involvement in this entire enterprise, that they in fact paid the world media to suppress the kind of suppress media coverage of this event.
And it was not that way socialism, as you rightly say. It was guided democracy.
It was democracy. It was guided democracy, and it was a legal outfit that was there, and people who were a part of this movement, and all those with any kind of affiliation with the other government. So they did not just take the government away or kill Sukarno, or oust the leaders. They actually killed every sympathizer in the country who had any alliance or any sympathies for the government, and this was done entirely by the backing, by the support of United States.
This has been happening all over the world, and literature, I think, is able to see this for what it is. It articulates the emotions so very effectively, and this poem, stands testimony.
Yes, and there is another one. Since we have some time, maybe I can read another poem of Apin. And these, so he wrote a series of these poems titled "Poems for a Little Sister." So they went into 3, 4, 5 till 13. Also, there is what I'm going to read is the 4th one in the series of Poems for a Little Sister.
There will be a short one because there is time constraint.
Yes, this is a short one. So the days are getting shorter, fingers stiffen, chilled by the night. They cannot give things their final shape. Can we still hear the old dreams singing? Must we? Let the twilight cover over the day, and we'll watch with our stiff eyes. Tomorrow there'll be another day, but it will be getting shorter. Unquote. So this is the poem, a short poem, but again the poet's kind of dream and the inability to
How do you explain
dream.
it will become shorter?
Yes, that there is a kind of, I think the poet at this turn is turning his hopes are turning bleak, and or there is a sense that the days are shorter now, or maybe he's going to be nabbed any day. There is also a kind of apprehension that he, like many others, would be taken in and would be killed.
And how simple and how profound.
Yes, and simply just talking about days getting shorter and then correlating with cold, the weather itself, that it's getting cold, my fingers are freezing, I'm not able, and he says that I don't know, my eyes are stiffened and so are my fingers. So suggesting that I'm not even able to write. So the creative enterprise of the writer as well, the creative practice of the writer, as it gets inhibited by the pressures that work on him and the kind of fears that he faces in this kind of a situation, but that he must exist. And so in the other poem which is also the poem for my little sister, in his last stanza he becomes resilient when he says, we don't expect to want to turn back, we are delighted to shape ourselves according to the time and place, and to rush forward to throw ourselves down, and to rush forward to throw ourselves down. unquote. So, there's a kind of resilience that has come back into the poet's mind that, well, we will go and jump and leap if we have to in this kind of death.
So against that kind of dance of death, there are people who can assert life, assert vitality, and tell us about hope, about optimism.
And in the present situation. So, it's kind of a moving tale of that period, which is generally blotted out in the history of Indonesia, I think.
But you can't take things away from literature for all time to come.
That's true.
And human beings, will assert themselves politically, ideologically, and also poetically.
Yes. So in fact, there is a group of Lekra writers that come into being in the 1950s and 60s and continue. So Rivayapan is one amongst them. But then there are others who will continue this tradition of talking about the sufferings of the farmers, the people at large.
And he would join so very well with the rest of the world.
Right.
This kind of movement is happening against capitalism, imperialism all over the world.
Yes.
So people who are suppressed will come forward and they will join as a voice of what we have been saying all through world literature.
Yes, that's true.
So in just 3 or 4 sentences, can you conclude? Can you just tell us what exactly you have pursued through your lecture?
What I tried to suggest through the lecture is that Indonesia as a country was in a state of turmoil and change, political change, social change in the 20th century, and particularly the kind of a watershed kind of a decade was the 1940s when Indonesian revolution took place, and how it changed the face of writing and literary works that came to the fore, and how the movement in the direction of a kind of democracy or a kind of with its alliance with communism also, I think it tried to create a kind of a world which it finally could not carry forward. So there have been certain hopes have been belied and disillusionment set in, and at the same time this kind of massacre and violence left a kind of a very deep impact on writers and thinkers, and they had to then mold their writing according to the times because of these very tumultuous decades, the 40s initially and the 60s later on. And also this kind of an endeavor among writers to unify at the level of language, experience, literature, and to be able to call themselves Indonesian in spirit. So this kind of pressure remains on the nationalist writers, and yet they're trying to bring a kind of a link between their regional experience and the modern sensibility.
Well, viewers, we've had a discussion on Indonesian writing, particularly with reference to poetry, and it was a country which was facing a great deal of upheaval in the last 50-60 years, and there was a nationalist movement, and that movement was uniting different regional identities into a positive unit, and finally, they would assert themselves as democrats. And as Dr. Richa Bajaj has pointed out, there was a guided kind of democracy that would be guided by the interests of the masses in general, and that would not allow those elements to come forward who were somehow violating the principles of democracy. So that's what is meant by guided democracy. And finally, the Sufi movement, the mystical movement, the movement, with art at its center, that turned into a kind of political voice, a kind of political revolt, and that happened under the influence of changes that were on the surface in Indonesia at that time. So I think literature, life, politics, ideology, they become one in many cases, and Indonesian writing is one example of this kind of phenomenon. So I hope you have enjoyed the discussion led by Dr. Richa Bajaj, and the points that she has made with examples, and she has related literature with actual situations in life. And now we come to the end of the lecture, and you can think about these things later, and you can share them with your friends, you can discuss, and you can reach your own conclusions. With that, we come to the end. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Richa Bajaj.
Thank you.